I see our participants number going up, so I'm assuming people are being let in now, but we'll hold off for a bit to get started. So thanks everyone who's joining. Should be an interesting discussion today, and we'll definitely want a lot of feedback with the attendees on questions you have or thoughts you have about this topic. Now, the presentation link actually says passive sustainability, whereas the intended topic is actually passive survivability, although those topics are kind of related to each other. So sorry for any confusion around that, but the speakers will give their background related to passive survivability, and then, but again, we can kind of, these are informal and can be loose a bit on what topics we discuss. So let's hold on a few more minutes. I do look like we're kind of steady around 30, but it's just been 2 minutes, so I can hold off a little. All right, so I think I'll go ahead and get started now. I know more people might trickle in as we go, but this part will be recorded, so if someone misses this part, they can always catch it later. So I'm going to introduce the 3 speakers. They're all going to kind of present their background and a little bit about their work for about 10 minutes each. That'll leave us about half an hour for discussion. And during that discussion, you all can unmute yourselves, and we'll probably raise hands to see who unmutes themselves, or if you want to type in questions, that's fine as well. So I'll introduce all 3 of them, and then they can do their presentations. So first presentation will be Dr. Eliza Hotchkiss. She recently was selected to be the new director of the Energy Security and Resilience Center at NREL. She's also recognized as a global leader in disaster recovery, resilience science, international sustainable development, and energy security. And her pioneering work in resilience includes developing metrics for assessing and monetizing resilience and energy security solutions, energy security frameworks, and resilience assessment methodologies. The second presenter will be Dr. Zolton Nagy. He's an IBPSA World Fellow, is also a building systems expert specializing in smart buildings, renewable energy systems, and sustainable building operations. He is combining robotics and artificial intelligence backgrounds, and he directs the Intelligent Environments Laboratory, developing advanced control systems for zero emissions buildings. And he is a co-operating agent of the IEA Human-Centric Building Network that investigates the evolving role of humans in the energy transition to address climate change. And Zolton, I should also point out, is on the IBPSA-USA Research Committee. And then the last speaker will be Dr. Nathaniel Jones. He is a senior building scientist at IRP and an architecture professor at Wentworth Institute of Technology, and he's the president of IBPSA-USA. Nathaniel created Comfort, an IRP advanced online tool for comfort modeling, which uses peer-reviewed thermal regulatory models to understand the thermal comfort of diverse building occupants. So thanks to all the speakers for coming, and thanks for all the attendees who are here. And Eliza, if you'd like to start now, you can share your screen.
Excellent. Thanks, David.
You're welcome.
And I should say before we get started, one thing that David didn't mention is that my master's degree is in energy efficient and sustainable architecture. So I always like talking about buildings. So if any of you have questions, feel free to pose them in the chat and we can talk more about some of these concepts. But David asked me to present today on a project that we conducted here at NREL based on some feedback that we got from the Department of Energy's Buildings Technologies Office, where they were really trying to understand how energy efficient buildings can increase resilience and improve public safety. So we undertook a project with two other national labs here in the United States, one, the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, or PNNL, and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab was the other one, LBNL. And we created a joint methodology, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and applied it to different tools and models that each of the labs are responsible for. NREL adapted our residential building stock model to simulate different buildings during both a heat wave and a cold snap to understand the impacts of extreme temperature during different outage events, so grid outages that lasted different durations. And we really were trying to understand what the impacts on building occupants was. So the research as a whole across the three labs resulted in a standardized methodology to quantify the impacts of building design measures during power outages. And we used a safe indoor temperature threshold as our metric for passive survivability. So this work really was quantifying how energy efficiency technologies and design measures can enhance building resilience in extreme temperature conditions when there is a power outage. So very specific in scope, and I'll talk a little bit more about our approach, our methodology, and some of the results. The approach that we used was to focus on the United States, and sorry, this map is so fuzzy, it's not a great resolution image. But we focused initially on 6 representative cities so that we could include different climate zones across the United States. We focused on the contiguous US because that's where we have data in all of our models and tools across the 3 labs. And we wanted to simulate both extreme heat and extreme cold events that occurred during a simultaneous power outage lasting different durations. NREL, as I mentioned, used the residential building stock model that we have here at the lab, ResStock, to model existing buildings. PNNL used the methodology that we developed to apply it to new buildings or model and code buildings. And then LBNL conducted a counterfactual analysis looking at assisted living facilities in Texas and in Florida to understand how these metrics could be applied to specific facility types. We used a thermal resilience metric of standard effective temperature, which I'll talk a little bit about, and then also conducted a mortality and an investment benefit cost ratio estimate. I did not include those estimates and that valuation in this presentation. I really just wanted to focus on the thermal resilience metrics because we are thinking about passive survivability. So our methodology was to look at risk, and the way that we're defining risk in this instance is the likelihood that an event will occur or the frequency, the type of exposure, and the vulnerability that will be exposed during an event. And in order to do that, we looked at the different types of hazards that are most likely to occur in different hazard regions. Obviously, they're very different in locations like Florida compared to the Pacific Northwest. We also used historic extreme temperature event data to validate and verify some of the assumptions that we were making. And we used historic event data to understand what the joint probability was that a temperature extreme would occur during a disruptive outage type scenario. We then applied that hazard data to our exposure analysis and included that in our building simulations using building stock characteristics, thermal performance metrics within the ResStock analysis model that we have, and tried to understand what passive survivability looked like within res stock when temperature conditions, wet bulb temperatures got outside of a certain range and it was no longer safe for occupants to stay within their residential building in this case. We then looked at the impacts associated with these exposure analyses. We looked at vulnerability curves, susceptibility factors, and then we tried to ascertain what damages would occur to properties, as well as what the occupant health risks were. I'll talk a little bit more about why that is not so robust and where there's future work needed in that space. And then as part of this effort, again, we're not going to dive into this too much, but we looked at the value at risk. So the mitigation measures, the upgrades and annualized damage costs, the benefit cost ratio, and then the value of resilience were all applied mostly within the new build case studies. And I think that there's some room for improvement for some of the valuation techniques that we incorporated there. So just highlighting a little bit of what we did with the hazard risk assessment and the joint probability analysis. We did use historic data from 1980 to 2020 so that we could understand where there are extremes and what those thresholds might be for the 6 representative cities. We used the Ujo method for identifying extreme events, so anything that falls within a certain threshold was considered. And we get this question a lot, so I thought it was important to include this here. The Department of Energy's Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security and Emergency Response has a form that is completed. It's called the OE 417 form, where utilities are supposed to fill out information related to different grid outages, including the cause of the outage, the time of the initial outage, the restoration period, and how many customers were affected. So we applied that and created histograms so that we could understand the probability of different types of events occurring in these 6 representative cities and understand the duration of outages. And that was important for the passive survivability metrics that we were trying to quantify within the buildings. The exposure analysis used a thermal resilience metric where we used standard effective temperature so that we could understand what was considered livable and where people could stay within a building and use a household as a passive survivability strategy. So the set above 86 Fahrenheit or below 54 Fahrenheit were considered to be outside of that safety threshold. And that's when we assumed residents might need to evacuate their homes during these different situations. So we also included heat index hours and then hours of safety and really settled on that set degree hours as the main metric for thermal resilience in this scenario. So some of the results that we had generated were based on the existing building stock, as I mentioned, which was modeled through our res stock tool. And you can see that on the slide here, hopefully, in orange, where we can look at a heat event. And we had a short heat event and a long heat event ranging in different durations of outage hours. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the long heat event results from a scenario that occurred in 2012 in Atlanta, Georgia. And this is based on the standard effective temperature within the existing building stocks within Atlanta specifically. Then we modeled what the impacts might be with current code, IECC 2021 at the time, and then with an upgrade code if we were to include passive house standards for that. And on here, you can see that there's a shift in that safety range, and the outdoor temperature is modeled in the black line, which should be consistent throughout the long heat event. But you can see that the hours associated with that safety threshold change in the dotted lines. Hopefully you can see it. It's a little fuzzy here. Um, and with the existing building stock, it's a much higher threshold in terms of the temperature that is being met. So the easiest way to compare this is the chart on the left shows 976 for set, and then the chart on the right shows 352. So it's a pretty stark difference for just this one representative city. And this is an example of some of the results that we were modeling. Um, I'll just show you one other example to show how we differentiated between the extreme heat event and an extreme cold event, where we started with Houston and on the left, and then Minneapolis, St. Paul on the right. I don't expect you to be able to digest all of this information in a quick amount of time, but it's really demonstrating that what we were trying to do is model how existing building stock really does influence the energy efficiency, but then the ability to shelter in place during extreme heat events or extreme cold events. And so these results are available in our final report, which is online, and I can send the link to David so he can share more broadly if needed. But all of the results for each of the 6 representative cities are included in that for all of the different metrics that I talked through, not just for the set degree hours. So I wanted to just show that as a highlight of some of the research that we have been doing at NREL. It's a really complex and complicated research space, as I'm sure you can all appreciate. But the goal for this analysis was to develop a standardized methodology that each of the 3 labs could implement into their models and tools, depending on the design and the strategies being considered and the stage of the design, either existing or new buildings. And our goal was to quantify the impact of efficiency on thermal resilience. So in this case, passive survivability metrics were translating into set degree hours. This has been integrated into our Open Studio platform. So if any of you use those models, Energy Plus, as an example, these thermal resilience metrics are available and can be utilized if you're interested in what those might look like. I think there are additional needs for future work, which are improving estimates of occupant exposure, occupant damages, and then property damages with better data, better models. We've done some additional analysis with this, looking at historic redlined neighborhoods to look at deferred maintenance or investment and how that can affect performance, which then leads to additional future work because there's a lot that can be unpacked there. And then these methods and findings can inform different stakeholder decision-making or policy-making processes, and I think have a lot of different applications depending on what everyone is interested in, and if it's building performance standards, if it's resilience, or lead passive survivability, and how that could be enhanced through some of the modeling that we've been doing. So hopefully that was 10 minutes, David. I didn't want to take too long.
No, that was perfect. That was great. That was a very good overview.
Okay.
I do think what we'll do is, instead of taking questions now, we'll try to go through all 3 presenters and then do questions as a group at the end. So Zolton, are you ready to go?
I am. Yes. Let me share. And I will share. Here we go. Hi, everyone. Okay, you can see my screen. I can go full screen. And okay, you should see the red dot. All right, welcome everyone. I'm Zoltan. I'll talk also about passive survivability, tagging on a little bit where Eliza left us off. Talking about a new metric that we've been working on, more academic side, but generally talking about the same problem. Oopsie. Hold on. Does it work? Okay. So from a sort of modeling perspective, since it's a IBPSA community, I think we as a community are somewhat, in a at a place now where this topic becomes more and more important, right? So on one hand we have climate change, and so more and more we need to move away to simulate TMY stuff because it's simply not realistic anymore. It's also not realistic just for today's weather, but it certainly will not be realistic for future weather. And so on top of just a normal shift of weather, we need to understand how we can model and simulate extreme weather events, whether that's historic or worse, and then how we simulate and integrate into our modeling and simulation tools the accumulating effect of, yes, we have extreme heat or extreme cold and then a power outage, or whatever, extreme rainfall and something else. So these things will happen more often, more extreme. And so the normal procedures of how we model buildings and then what the code does is not, useful anymore. And then the other shift that's happening or that needs to happen, I think, is think more about people. At this point, a lot of our metrics are very much building focused. And so we need to not go away, but also understand how people are impacted. And again, we don't talk about comfort when we're under extreme events, right? We talk about survivability, livability. What can we do under the circumstances? And really think about the impact on people rather than the impact on the structure in some sense, so that we understand the true implications on the communities. And so I'll talk about the second topic. We work with a new metric, but for the first, if you are interested, there's a lot of work. Look at the dates. February 2025, March, and April 2025. These are all review papers trying to situate basically our community of building simulation into this extreme weather and what needs to be done. What extreme weather data is being used. This is LBNL mostly, and then colleagues in Europe is about what happens with things and climate change. This and Daniel's name, also mentioning the fact that once we start going into this topic of climate change, there is a lot of people from the climate science community who have done a lot of thinking. And so what needs to happen is that we come together and understand how their large scale and large temporal resolution models translate into our hourly, sub-hourly, TMY equivalent models, so that we can actually use their results and forecasts in a reasonable way. Today, the situation is that a lot of us understand that we need to model forecast future events and typical and extreme weather, and we've done it, but it happens at an ad hoc level, and there's no standardized way to do it. And so a lot of work, and this is why you see these review papers, is because we try to establish this practice. What I want to talk about, like I said, is the challenges on the comfort or on the people side. And there's a lot of these limits that we've seen about the SCT that Eliza just talked about. There's typical comfort bands. Sometimes we hear in terms, especially in areas with high humidity, a wet bulb limit of 35 degrees Celsius would be a survivability limit. We know the heat index. Some colleagues use a discomfort index, which is the average between temperature and humidity, an ad hoc value to assess them easily. And so we tried to get away from this and flip a little bit. And so we introduced this what's called activity hours, which is based on somebody else's work that I'm putting down here, which simulated physiological limits. So if you placed people with a certain environment with a certain characteristics, where would the limits be for survivability? And so part of their work to critique the 35 wet bulb temperature line. So you can see that built in here in the temperature humidity plot. And so you can see the drier environment is, a lot of this work is from from Phoenix, Arizona. The worse that assumption of survivability goes for 35 degrees Celsius. But what's more is what you have now is limits for what metabolic rate you can do at what sort of environmental conditions, right? So what humidity and temperature, what is a safe activity level that you can do? And so as a simulators, we're like, well, we can just take this and plot our hours on this during an event and see where we end up. Because it's not black and white, right? It's gray, as this where you can do stuff, but then you end up into the livability limit, which in this assumption has shorts, and you don't do anything. You sit in your house and that's it. And survivability limit assumes you're naked and lying on your bed, and then you're exposed to basically dying. And so now that you have this kind of limit and you can see them, you can basically plot the hours in your event onto this chart and count them in what group you fall in, and you can see how things are and how things will change. And that's, in my view, that's really easy to communicate, because on this side you're death, here it's very close to it, and here you're kind of getting there. And so we did a case study with this approach in London, because there's no air conditioning in that area, and because my co-authors were from the UK. So we used the UK building archetypes. They're similar to Restock's, all kinds of different buildings, multi-zone, residential, and then looked at past heat waves and how we could forecast that into the future. What is a heat wave in 2050 going to do? And on top of the heat waves, one thing we also need to do is urban heat island on top of it, because in several locations that can add easily 2-3 degrees Celsius. And so we looked at those, and this is the kind of plots you get. You can see in the TMY data, everything would be very nice. This is a semi-detached house. And as you move to real heat wave, which is 2022 heat wave here, you know, things get already a little bit moving over. And then as you project forward, you're reaching these limits in this house for this particular community. If you go to another house, very easily in a flat to the top floor, it's easy to say, to think about it. But again, you can see very clearly that this will reach anything, you know, that you have to consider unsurvivable or unlivable in these areas. And similarly, even for young people, you can say, well, they're not as affected, but even for those, you can see you reach livability limits very fast, depending on building type, house type, where you are, even in a location like London, right? And this is very typical for a lot of European and cities where there's no air conditioning in that case. So my message here was, you know, we need to rethink how we actually advocate for these, because temperatures are not enough, humidity, and all of those are really wishy-washy when it to real risk, because anything at this point, it just may do at what level. And so I think there needs to be a shift to communicate these a little bit better, all during events and as you forecast event. More generally, as David said, there is a lot of work in this area. So I'm co-leading one of these annex tasks with Liam and Julie and Marianne, and we just kicked this off. There's a lot more to explore, but the idea is, again, to shift away a little bit from buildings that we understand very well to the impact on the occupants and marginalized communities, and, you know, concepts like resilience and sufficiency, and how can we adapt and do it in a way that lets us adapt to climate change, because that will happen anyway. And so at the same time, we need to understand how we can do that moving forward. So that's my pitch. I look forward to this discussion. And there's a link at the bottom if you're interested more in this annex activities. Thank you.
Thanks, Zolton. That's great. I can see, like, for manufacturing or any sort of like people's job performance quality or safety risk might change based on how far they are in there. Anyway, I'm breaking my rule to ask the question, but so Nathaniel, are you ready to talk a little, and then we'll go into the discussion?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing, now in design of buildings. A lot of the buildings I'm going to show are more commercial in nature, so hopefully when we really do have those long periods of blackout, people go home and aren't occupying them. But at the same time, we have a lot of concerns about what is happening with climate. And I think that there's generally just a need to understand who are the populations that are at the most risk as a result of changing temperatures and potential for loss of power, and why that risk occurs and what we can do to simulate it. And now we're starting to take some of the tools that we've been using to understand thermal comfort and apply them to survivability as well. Unfortunately, we're seeing more and more headlines like the ones on the screen about these events that lead to mass casualties, and extreme heat is now the leading cause of death among all natural disasters, above hurricanes and floods and others. And when we look at trends, this is the number of deaths in Texas due to extreme heat over the last 20 years, and we can see that 3 of the 4 highest death tolls are all in the last couple of years, and that it's a direct result of climate change. And so, one question is, well, where could you live in order to just live passively without needing to really worry about these? And so this is a chart, a map that was produced almost a century ago, showing where people could live in the black, where people could live without the need for climate control. And so you get this idea that's very heavily European focused. So it's basically saying that Europe is a place where people can live comfortably, and Europeans, when they leave Europe, can inhabit certain other areas. And this was a way of thinking for a long time, which really sort of ignored the needs of non-European cultures, and privileged the comfort of people with a continental sensibility about temperature. And then beyond that, of course, we have this practice of redlining. This is a map of Boston and Cambridge. So where I am right now, which outlines this practice that people could live in different areas according to their means, but those means were heavily influenced by race and ethnicity. And so these redlined areas tended to be poorer areas. And when we look at what that has done to those areas today, we can see that directly corresponding to the urban heat island effect. So in the map on the left in red, we have areas of Boston that are highly sensitive to that urban heat island, that have large amount of concrete, brick, but generally hard surfaces, very few trees, very little foliage that would help to dissipate that heat. And then on the right, areas that have high disadvantaged populations. So there's a large number of children or elderly or non-English speaking populations. And that correspondence between those areas that experience high heat and those areas that experience poverty and have a large number of disadvantaged people become very apparent. So what we've looked at doing is taking models that we have that help us to describe people's the heat transfer through people's body and their level of comfort as a result of that, and describe those with advanced comfort models. What you see in the pictures, this woman who is seated at a desk, she's doing an office type activity. She's really filling out a thermal comfort survey. And while she's doing that, she's got a bag of air strapped to her back, and that bag is full of cold air. And by doing this kind of study, we understand how forcing a temperature on someone affects their level of comfort, their sense of well-being, and we can do that with different temperatures, looking at different parts of their body. That kind of information has now been put together with these thermoregulatory models that look at how heat is transferred through the body and help us to understand how the body reacts to those temperatures. And from these, we can take an environment and get both the sense of what is happening within the body and also in the person's brain, how they feel about those conditions. And that's what our company developed in our advanced comfort tool, which we've published now in a couple of IBPSA papers to describe what this tool does, how it works, and to understand how we can set up these what we call journeys to track someone through a set of different thermal conditions and see how they feel and how their body responds to that. What I think is particularly interesting about this is that we can get away from assumptions about a standard body type. The standard man is sort of like the basis for ASHRAE, and we can start to adjust that to look at an individual's comfort or to compare the comfort of a number of different people to see how the population reacts to these different conditions. And I'll show through a couple of examples. First of all, this is just some work that my students have done, tracing their own environment over a 24-hour period to understand their exposure to heat and cold, to see how a model like this predicts that they should feel about that and compare that to their lived experience. but then also compare that to predictions about other people, so they can see how their own sense of thermal comfort, of course, they're mostly, late teens, early 20s. They, tend to be young and fit relative to the overall population, so they experience these temperatures differently from the way that other people would experience them, and that is important for them to understand. What we're starting to do now is to look at how we can push these models to the extremes. And in this case, we really are doing that, taking a model of a person exposed to high heat, 120 degrees Fahrenheit for a 5-hour period. And in this particular case, we've got 100 different individuals uh, whose physiology matches the range that we see in the US population, um, to start to track what happens to their bodies with that length of exposure. And so we understand now that when the temperature of when your core body temperature increases by about a degree Celsius, you start to experience some physiological issues that can be the onset of heat illness. So we can start to see where that happens, and it doesn't take too long under those really extreme conditions to get someone to that point. But a model like this doesn't tell us yet what is causing that heat illness. So then we can start to probe into some other parameters happening in these physiological models and these thermoregulatory models to see what's going on. And one of the interesting things is to look at heart rate. So we know that in order to move heat out of your core, to get it out of your body, we need to bring it to our skin. And so in order to do that, we use the blood, our circulatory system, to produce convection within the body to move that heat from the core to the periphery. And as we bring up the temperature, we start to require much more blood flow in order to move heat quickly enough. And we understand from reviewing the literature that high heat is associated with a competition for blood between the organs that need oxygen and the skin that needs the heat disposal. And a model like this then helps us to understand how that competition is occurring. In this case, we're tracking the heart rate that's required to expel that amount of heat to the skin. And of course, the model, one of the things that we found is the model doesn't actually know if a person is alive or dead. It's just going to keep pushing uh, the heat transfer to do what it thinks needs to be done to meet the person's thermoregulatory needs. In this case, it's predicting that for almost the entire population, we have heart rates of 400 to 600 beats per minute necessary to move that amount of heat around, which means that we know that someone in these conditions is going to experience cardiac failure. And so that's something that we can now look at as, understanding what is the mechanism that is happening in the body that's leading to heat illness, or essentially meaning that they can't regulate their body temperature under these conditions. So we are using these tools in the design of buildings. We don't expect anyone to stay in these buildings if they get to those temperatures, but they give us a way to look at how people react. And what I really want to emphasize is that if we look at the way that a person experiences this building, on a hot day going into an air-conditioned space, for example, it's not sufficient just to look at a standard body type. We really do need to do population analysis. And moving away from the ASHRAE, standard into a larger variety of body types helps us see that there are people where if all we're doing is providing air conditioning, some people start to complain of the cold. And when we take that air conditioning away, we have a different set of people who complain about heat. And so really what we need to do is find ways that we can treat the space that respond to the needs of the entire population, which in this case is providing shading to get rid of the sunlight that's causing the heat issue. And so this has been really important for us for the way that we work. Looking at another case, a new academic building at Northeastern, we can start to look at how the conditions in the space vary spatially. So in this case, we're looking at how the windows in this large glazed level lead to heat discomfort close to the surfaces, and we can start to map this out instead of just looking at timelines. It also allows us to pull this information into more complex models. This is a chemistry laboratory in the same space. In this case, we're using computational fluid dynamics to understand the movement of air in the space and bring it back into that thermoregulatory model. So we have people in the space who experience the conditions that are being provided, and we can see how that then relates to their skin temperature, and then to their sense of comfort as a result of those conditions. So I've got my email address here because I like to get back feedback, but I think that we are also going to go into some discussion now and look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thanks, Nathaniel. That's very interesting. So yeah, what we're going to do now, I will stop the recording, and I believe I can do that. And then if people want to raise their hand, and then you can unmute and turn on your camera if you'd like to ask questions. You can try to ask questions in chat, but that's a little harder. So just give me a second here, and I think I can pause the recording or stop it.